Welcome back to Missing. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today. Thank you so much for asking. I hope everyone who's listening, I hope they're all doing great. Tim, today we have on a guest who is, I would say, a new friend of the show, and he's very reminiscent of some journalists that we've spoken with in the past. Journalists, investigative reporters, authors who are relentless in their pursuit of answers. I'll say justice, but I think those answers lead to justice. So that's where they first go, is the relentless pursuit of answers. But Tim, before we get to that, I want to know, I have a relentless pursuit to know how you're doing. Answer me that.
Doing great. Thanks a lot for listening. I don't have to write a New York Times bestseller to answer that question, Lance. But our guest today, Mr. Shawn Cohen, did write a New York Times bestseller on the disappearance of Lauren Spierer. And the book is called College Girl Missing, and there are links in the show notes. It is a fantastic read and audio book, which is how I consumed it. But this case is really fascinating, Lance, and insanely tragic. And Lauren Spierer went missing from Bloomington, Indiana on June 3rd, 2011. She was 20 years old at the time of her disappearance. I think she was 5 feet and has blonde hair.
And this disappearance is one that has always been on our radar, and I feel very fortunate to be in the position, as I'm sure you do, to discuss this with somebody who is not only an expert on her disappearance, but somebody who has worked with the family through the good, the bad. They started off with a rocky relationship, and then he won their trust. He earned their trust and has been working with the family ever since. And I think that's an important note to take from this, is that there is a way to, again, relentlessly pursue answers and make that inclusive of a healthy relationship with the family. And he does that. And he's very unassuming as well.
And Lauren actually is 4'11", so just a shade under 5 feet, but also only 95 pounds. And so a very, very small young woman. And the story, Lance, is just bizarre as far as after she was out that night. She was out. She got intoxicated. She was with a few acquaintances. And then the trail kind of just stops. And it's really shocking to think of what may have happened to Lauren. And we do discuss these possibilities with Shawn Cohen in this interview, so we get some insight on what we think happened, but we'll save more of that for our final thoughts after the interview with Shawn, so make sure to stay tuned till that part.
Yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. We've been doing these final thoughts periodically when we have a story that we really want to consume and sort of absorb after the fact, as the listener does, and the final thoughts are literally just that. Like, we have listened to it back and we now have some additional comments, which, yeah, I do have. So really stay tuned for that, or just fast forward right to it. I don't know. But it comes at the end. So that's where you're going to get our final thoughts. And I'm not going to say any more about this because I really want to provide some further insight later on. And if you want to learn more about the search for answers in Lauren's story, go to findlauren.com. And on that website, you can contact the Bloomington Police Department at 812-339-4477 or the Indiana University Police Department at 812-855-4111, or you can send an anonymous tip to Find Lauren, P.O. Box 1226, Bloomington, Indiana 47402.
Okay, great. So we'll play the interview with Shawn Cohen now, and make sure to check out Shawn's book. It's called College Girl Missing. It is a great book, and it's a really fast audio book. I want to say it's only like a 5-hour audio book listen, so definitely very bingeable, which is how I listened. So hope you enjoy that book, and I hope you enjoy this interview, and follow us on social media at Missing CSM, and we will be back for final thoughts after the conversation with Shawn Cohen. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn Cohen. Shawn, how are you today?
I'm good. Great. Waking up in California with this atmospheric river that didn't quite hit us.
That has never been
It's a big storm. Yeah.
so that we have introduced a lot of guests on this show, and no one has ever said that. So right off the bat, you're something special.
Yeah. Thanks.
But we also just went through about 10 minutes of technical difficulties, and when you get to that point, the conversation that follows is usually really good because it's like 10 minutes of pent up stuff that we wanted to get to, and we will get to it. But before we do, can you let the listeners know who you are, what your specialty is, and maybe a little bit on why we have invited you to the show?
Well, my name's Shawn Cohen. I've been a journalist for over 30 years now. Since Northeastern University, I studied journalism, and I've basically focused on crime in my past 20 years. And I was working for the Journal News in Westchester, New York, when a girl named Lauren Spierer went missing from Indiana University. And I was the lead investigative reporter for that paper. And they sent me out to Indiana to start digging into that case. So here we are, 13 plus years later.
Yes, and you've written a book about Lauren Spierer's disappearance. Can you tell us what went into the decision to write the book?
So back in 2011, when she went missing, I did a lot of stories on it, and I was able to kind of ferret out what happened to her that night in really kind of spare detail, that she went out with somebody who wasn't her boyfriend, and where she ended up in this townhouse with these male students. A few months later, the case really went cold, and the family went home, and the fresh reporting on the case, kind of hit a rock wall. So year after year, there were anniversary pieces, and there really wasn't much new information coming out. Lauren Spierer was still missing, and the family had no answers, and their whole life was kind of trapped in, trying to find out what happened as time went on. So it was probably about 7 years later that I was between jobs, and I decided I had, finally had the opportunity to go at that case full time, revisit it, and I thought that over time that maybe some new information would shake free. It would be an opportunity to go at some of these persons of interest, the last people who were with that night. So I approached the family all those years later, and they, for the first time, agreed to really open up about what they'd found, and they allowed me full access to what they had discovered through their private investigators. So I dug into the files, and I started going at the reporting again. Yeah,
it's amazing the work that you've put into this, and it's incredible how long the time frame is, how it spans this space of time. And you revisited it, like you said, you had this opportunity as you were in between projects to dig into this. Was it always there, though, in the back of your head as this case that you wanted to really push out again into the public spotlight to get some of those questions answered for the family? And how often did you sort of, I guess, refresh your own memory on it in the meantime?
This was a rare case for me because I worked on a billion stories, but this particular one, the parents of this girl, Lauren Spierer, I of course never met her, but the family, when I met them on the streets of Bloomington, Indiana, were pretty hostile to me because I was digging for information while the police investigation was turning up its own information, and they thought I was kind of leave it to the police, not up to a reporter to try and ferret out what happened. And there were a lot of painful details about that night that I was putting in the out there publishing. But after we all went back to New York, I kept up with them and started to grow close to them. So over the years, even when there wasn't new information, I'd still meet them for, at the diner, just talk to them, get to know each other. And I think they came to appreciate my aggressiveness and also my knowledge of the case, that I seemed to have a better grasp of the details and what happened that night than anyone else in journalism anyway. So they trusted me when I reapproached them, and that was the whole pitch to them, was that that it was important to go at this case and show people everything, the context, what happened, and really push the envelope on the reporting. That's something that hadn't been done before. You really, it was quite an opportunity for me, but also a great responsibility to go at it again.
That's incredible. That's so cool that you were able to get past the initial impression that the parents had towards you, which it seems kind of silly to say that that's an important thing, but there are people out there in your position who would not take too kindly to that they would say, like, well, they're a bunch of assholes. Like, they don't understand what I'm trying to do. How did you, like, as a journalist, understand that you needed this to, like, how did you get past that?
I think it was kind of we both ultimately wanted to get the truth out there. I'm a pretty hard charging reporter, and going after information that what happened that night was painful for them to see out in the media early on. But over time, they just kind of accepted that you really do need to dive into that information and put it out there, to understand what happened, because they have, their suspicions about what happened, and you really can't understand why they feel the way they feel unless you really dive into the case. So I think over time, Charlene Spierer, the mom of Lauren, just a really nice lady, someone I really bonded with or have bonded with. She grew up just maybe 20 minutes down the road from where I grew up. I'm sorry, that's where Lauren Spierer lived and where they were living. They were living in just outside of near the Scarsdale train station. I grew up in Mayapack, like 20 minutes up the road. Jewish family, Jewish upbringing. I have the same kind of secular upbringing, and I was working. My office was in White Plains, just down the road, and so we just have a lot of familiarity with each other's kind of daily existence. And yeah, over time, we grew really close.
Great. So you got the blessing of the Spear family, and they participated as far as giving you more information that you had in the case. Now, what about police? Were they as open?
As I went at this, it started with basically spending weeks going through the private investigative files. These were retired NYPD detectives who were in this like big firm in New York City, and they had gone to Indiana and dug into the case. Back in those early days, the police were holding press conferences that really didn't reveal any information. They weren't revealing what they were finding in their investigation. And when I did return to the case and return to Indiana to reapproach the cops, and thinking maybe at this point they would, sit down with me, or maybe some foils would actually succeed in getting some of the basics of what they had found. And, again, I hit a stone wall. I couldn't even get past the lobby. So I ended up reaching out to stopping by certain detectives' homes, and then finding out officers and detectives who had worked on the case back in 2011, who had moved on from that department, and tracked them down. And I did find a few of those individuals who did speak with me and, shared about some information that I hadn't heard before. And also, took some shots at the Bloomington police for what they didn't do in those early days. The lack of aggressiveness, the lack of cooperation with outside law enforcement, certain things that, had they been done very early on, they might have made more headway.
This is sort of a unrelated observation and question. You said that you stopped by certain people's homes and knocked on the doors, and then you asked questions, and you've and we know that you are a relentless pursuer of truth and information and to get answers. So where does that come from? How is that the style or the method that you've chosen? Is it partially the adrenaline of doing that and knowing that you can get that information?
Well, every case you go at is different. You always have to think of what, when you approach someone, you have to think what might motivate them to want to talk. And it's different for each person. And I know that, when I learn about the circumstances for certain officers leaving that department, if it was under good circumstances or negative, you could see who might be more inclined to talk. I'm a veteran at this stuff, and I've talked to a lot of cops, and I just familiar with some of the real challenges that they face, and the jurisdictional issues and the lawyer issues and the community issues. So in Bloomington, Indiana, for instance, the local police force is dealing with high-powered lawyers, for the kids who they were questioning, and also a very wealthy university, Bloomington University, Indiana University in Bloomington, and so there are a lot of powers, forces in play that kept them pretty silent early on.
Now, can you tell us about the circumstances of Lauren's disappearance?
That's another thing I found really interesting is I really dug down into the details. Early on, I was able to report that she had gone out. She started her night at Smallwood Plaza, which is her off-campus apartment building where she was living. And she went out, and I learned early on with a guy named Corey Rossman, who was a student she'd met pretty recently. And then, there were some stumbles and falls, and she ends up at his place, and then two doors down at Corey's friend's place, Jay Rosenbaum. So those things I figured out pretty early on, and approached their lawyers. But going back into the case and looking through the investigative files, the private investigators had gone at a lot of these individuals and gotten some of them to talk, and I'd never heard their stories before. For instance, Lauren Spierer's 3 roommates shared some information with cops, weren't really talking to the press other than, sharing some fond memories of Lauren. And the boys, the last people who were with Lauren that night were talking, some of them were talking to cops, and they talked to the private investigators, others didn't. So when you take all that information together, I guess that's what I was able to lay out in the book. And what we learned, or what I learned, was Lauren Spierer that night, had it was a kind of pivotal time in her life, whereas she had just finished up her classes. She was waiting for her boyfriend, Jesse Wolf, to finish up in a couple weeks. Jesse was, a senior at that time. And they were arguing in recent days. Like 3 days before that night, Lauren met Corey Rossman for the first time, and Jay and others at the Indy 500. There was a big tailgate party there. So Lauren that night was arguing with Jesse, and Corey was trying to invite her up the street to this party that his friend Jay Rosenbaum was having in this townhouses up the street. So Lauren ultimately decided to go up the street and meet up with them, and she went to this party. Then she ended up going with Corey Rossman to a sports bar. Then she was pretty wasted at that point. She left her cell phone and shoes, and she and Corey made their way back to her apartment complex, and they go up to her floor, and there's they confront a group of boys, and one of them punches Corey in the face. And Corey, rather than taking Lauren to her room at that point, takes her out of her apartment complex. So you see them kind of like stumbling out of her apartment complex. So Corey and Lauren had up the street, and Corey has to carry her, and Lauren's falling along the way, and they end up in his townhouse complex, and that's where I really focused a lot of my reporting, is what happened in there.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
This one has that rabbit hole that a handful of disappearances have, where the deeper in you go and the more information you start pulling up, the further you go from the Wikipedia page of a disappearance, you start to see how dense all of this information is. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure this happened to you as you were putting together your book and in doing your own investigation. Was there any point in this where you thought like you couldn't separate some of the truths from maybe some information that was put out there, whether to misdirect people or just accidentally? How did you filter through all of that information to decide what mattered and what made sense?
Well, that was the great challenge of the book, I think, is trying to vet a lot of information that had been put out there from reliable sources and people just purely speculating. And there were certain people, names that were floated up the flagpole around that time, as like, there was this particular serial killer who was active in those years, and then there was a sexual predator who might have been in the area around that time. But I think the more you dig into the details of what happened that night, the story is that she ended up in not in Corey's place, but 2 doors down in Jay Rosenbaum's apartment. Jay's story is that she walked out of that apartment at about 4:15 in the morning, and that he watched her walk up to the corner where she would have rounded the corner and had to walk down the street a couple blocks back to Smallwood. But at this point, she didn't have her shoes, she didn't have her cell phone. According to various witnesses, she couldn't stand, she couldn't communicate, she could hardly even focus or recognize people that she knew along the route. So there would have been no cameras on that particular block that Jay says, she walked up to the corner. But around the corner, just if she were to walk a little ways, she would have been caught on a surveillance camera. And there was no footage that showed her. Certainly police would have shared that if they had it. So the family over time came to the strong suspicion that she never actually made it out of that townhouse complex. So one thing I wanted to do is at least look at the various theories. If she did make it out, could it have been this individual? Could it have been that individual? And I tried to dissect, why people were thinking that was a possibility, and then, why did police shoot it down ultimately? Then there were lots of rabbit holes online over the years that, a lot of kind of bullshit, really, when you look back at it. I think that I had an opportunity as a reporter, having access to these files and then getting to reapproach the individuals who were actually with Lauren that night, the final people who were with her that last night, to dissect their statements, how they evolved over time, how they contradicted each other, and that was really key for me to kind of show the story, what happened, and let readers kind of dive in as well, join me in that kind of mission to figure out, is this person telling the truth?
So out of the men or the young man or the boys around her, including her boyfriend Jesse Wolf, who seemed like they were, either misremembering or trying something else when you spoke with them.
Lauren Spierer was with Corey Rossman. Those were the last images you see of her going up the street. They went up to his townhouse, then went inside. So you have Corey Rossman inside, and his roommate, Mike Beth, who says he was inside that apartment. So you have Corey and Mike. Then you have two doors down was Jay Rosenbaum. And Jay Rosenbaum had a friend in town named David Blesnak. So you have four individuals, basically, who give or don't give their stories of what they saw and experienced with Lauren in those final moments before she, allegedly walked out that door. So Corey Rossman, his early on, before I could actually get him talking, his lawyer reached out to me and claimed that Corey lost memory of what happened that night. He had no memory of what happened that night. It was a year or so later that I got Corey ranting at me, and in his ranting, he kind of seemed to throw his lawyer under the bus and said, well, I didn't say I had no memory of that night. So I reported that maybe the 1 or 2 year mark. And then ultimately I got him back on the phone and had an hour-long conversation with him where we went at it. And, he was kind of doubling down on the memory loss theory. Mike Beth, who was his roommate at the time, did make some statements to the private investigator, but clammed up and made himself unavailable over time. Jay Rosenbaum did give some statements. In fact, he gave 3 interviews over time to the private investigators, and his statements evolved over time. For instance, this would take a long time to go into, but he said initially that she walked out the door and he watched her from the doorway walk up the street. The next time he was asked about it, he said after he opened the door, she walked out, he watched her walking up the street from his Juliet balcony, so 2nd floor. And in his follow-up accounts, he said he may have seen a shadowy figure approach her up at the corner before she would have rounded back to her place. In a later interview, he said, I definitely saw this shadowy figure approach her. And when I interviewed him, he went even further and said, he's convinced that that shadowy figure was this serial killer, Israel Keys. There was no proof of that. And Israel Keys would commit suicide in jail years later. So he can't be questioned about it. But I think that's a big thing is seeing what they actually said over time and evaluating that. David Blesnak, the story is that he was asleep. So he has nothing to say because he claims he was, asleep. And, but when you hear the stories of the other individuals, you learn that initially David Blesnak was awake for a little while when Corey came back from the bar. So it's kind of, that's the challenge, is presenting this so readers could understand it, grasp the differences. That's a challenge of putting together a whole book where people will not scratch their heads and say, fuck this, and throw it against the wall. You really have to help people understand.
Yeah, I think the only reason why I would scratch my head and throw it against the wall is because it's so remarkable that someone would consider the story about Israel Keys to be anything more than like a wild speculation. If you saw someone and later you realize that was Israel Keys, like how's your next move not calling the cops? How, like if you realize like, oh, it definitely was Israel Keys, that's your next move should be calling the cops without a doubt.
He only says that in his reading after the fact. He certainly wouldn't. He said it's a shadowy figure, and initially he wasn't, in his first account, he wasn't even seeing a person at the corner.
Exactly.
So it was over time that entered his account.
Exactly. That's why that's the only reason why I would throw the book against the wall, just out of frustration for somebody even thinking that that's a reasonable thing people are going to believe.
Right.
I want to go back just a little bit. You said you went at it with who is it that you called and you said you went at it with him for about an hour?
Both Corey Rossman and also Jay Rosenbaum.
Okay, when you say went at it, this is an aggressive conversation now.
So Lauren Spierer, through all the interviews that I was able to look at and also conduct, couldn't stand up on her own 2 feet, at least for a long part of that walk up the street, had to be carried. She wasn't recognizing people. I learned exactly which drugs she took, roughly how much alcohol, what type of alcohol she had taken, drank. I also knew, and of course, about her heart condition. She had a heart condition called QT syndrome, which under stress could cause your heart to stop. It's why when she was young, when it was diagnosed, the doctor said you should not be playing sports anymore and this is something you'll have to be very cognizant of and careful about for the rest of your life. So this was a person who'd fallen on the pavement a few times, hit the back of her head on a staircase so loud that someone walking by heard her head hit the staircase. So she was in very sad shape. And in talking to, when I finally got one of the private investigators talking, he told me he reviewed the entire case file and told me something I didn't know, which is that one of the last images of Corey and Lauren while he's like carrying her up the street was a point where she's actually seated down on a curb and he's standing up, pacing, making a phone call. It's like 3:00 in the morning. So I was obviously wanting to find out who he had tried to call. That's odd in this absolute moment of crisis with a girl who couldn't stand and in such bad shape, and you were with her that night, and you're not this girl's boyfriend. In that moment of crisis, who would he reach out to? I managed to get my hands on Corey's phone records from that night, cell phone records, and the phone number, and did a lot of research to figure out that it was this girl named Brooke Bullens who lives in Massachusetts. Corey Rossman grew up in Massachusetts. Was living in a place called Sharon, Massachusetts, before he came to college. And this girl, Brooke Bullens, was several years younger than him. I think she would have been about 17 at that time of Lauren's disappearance. And he reached out to her at 3:00 in the morning. And then the records also show that he actually made contact with her, hours later that afternoon, and had a few-minute conversation with her. So I went to Massachusetts and tried to track her down, and realized that she was kind of in hiding and her family was protecting her. And then I went back again later on and did confront her and got her talking some. Maybe it wasn't totally satisfying, but I also learned that from that Brooke's mom who called me, that Brooke back in 2011 had told her that recalled something that Corey had told her. He said Corey had told Brooke back in 2011 that they should not discuss anything specific on the phone because the FBI may be eavesdropping on our conversations. When I reached out, when I did a lot of reporting, I always kind of saved till the end the people I really wanted to speak with most, which was Corey and Jay and Mike and David Blesnak, the 4 last people who were with her that night. I finally reached out to Corey and Jay on the same morning, one after the other. And I learned through the conversations, they already knew that I was reaching out to all these other individuals. When I finally got Corey on the phone, he felt the pressure that I was working on this book, that I had alerted him through messaging that this book was in its final stages. He finally just picked up the phone and said, "What do you want?" He even mentioned he knew that I was going after Brooke Bullens. And he's like, "She's not going to talk to you." And I kept him on the phone for about 45 minutes. And we went through a lot, which I lay out in the book. After I got off the phone with Corey, I texted Jay, Jay Rosenbaum, who had reached out to earlier that same day. And I said, hey, I spoke with Corey, in my text to him. I said, hey, I'd spoken to Corey. It was a good conversation. Hopefully we could talk. I said something to that effect. And, a few minutes later, Jay does call me. He stepped out of his office where he was working and he calls me. He's like, okay, what do you want? So I had him on the phone for also 50 minutes and back and forth, to keep him on the phone. So those conversations were, hostile, but also, it's kind of like schizophrenic and angry toward me and also trying to come off as cooperative and forthcoming. So I really lay it out in just as much detail as I can, verbatim, how those conversations unfolded. And you get to see them, me asking them about the nuances of what they told private investigators or didn't tell private investigators. And, that I think helps the readers really understand what's, how much weight to give their statements.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. If it is true that Lauren never left that townhouse, how is it possible that these men let that happen and kept their mouths shut for all these years?
The family believes that they're withholding information even all these years later. There is, all these years later, no evidence that Lauren ever made it out of the townhouse complex alive. If in fact they were involved in her death, they're not acknowledging that. So, to ask them straight up, what the are you thinking? They're not going to answer that question. That's a damning kind of thing, a dangerous thing for them to just dive right in. Jay Rosenbaum in my speaking with him talked about, that she just was, wanting to continue partying and, insisted on walking out ultimately, and was somewhat dismissive of it's really his responsibility to, assure that she gets home. In his account, she seemed good enough to make her way home, even though everything I found out shows she really wasn't. So that's for commentators, I guess, to say why they may have done what they did.
Now, I'm curious, how credible is the idea that she may have accidentally overdosed and these guys scrambled to do something? I know that comes up in the book quite a bit. We do a show called Missing, and that's come up in several cases for us. So I'm kind of wondering if that's something that is specific to Lauren's case because of there being a possibility of that happening, or because that's just a rumor that happens in these missing persons cases with no answers.
But that's certainly a lead theory in the case, is that she died in the townhouses and that these boys, one or more of them, panicked and decided that it was time, that the fact that she was dead at that point, that they decided they had to not let it destroy their own lives. So they covered up at that point, if you go down that theory. And that's, a lot of people see that as the most logical theory, is that she died and maybe certain things happened, more than just dying, that and drugs and everything else, but maybe there was some physical activity between, say, Jay and Lauren, certain other things that could have been a factor in why you'd want to cover this up. So here we are in all these years later, and there's no evidence that she made it out. So we're just left to just kind of dive in and dissect what did happen in there.
Okay, so You said earlier that the police, I don't remember your exact wording, but you said the police could have pushed harder in the beginning. How could they have pushed harder?
Initially, it was understandably a missing persons case. Lauren had gone, and I'm not blaming the police here. Lauren, according to these boys' accounts, went missing at 4:00 in the morning. It wasn't until over, I think it was like 14 hours later, that a couple of the people who were friends of hers and her boyfriend went to the police and reported her missing. That particular night, it was a missing persons case, and they needed to figure out what was going on. So by the time they actually approached this as more than just a missing persons case, the boys had already lawyered up, and the several of them left town. Had they very quickly gone out in force and been more aggressive in going at the boys very early on, perhaps you could have gotten more information out of them. There were also questions about whether if she was in fact disposed of that morning, say at 4:00 in the morning, say she had died, and where did she end up? One theory is that she could have been placed in a dumpster. The dumpsters would have been taken away early that morning, long before cops had searched the area or had even an opportunity to search that immediate area. And they would have gone to a transfer station a few miles away. If the cops were very quick thinking and aggressive at it, they could have, gotten some kind of order to keep everything at the transfer station. But they didn't get to that point before the transfer station. Everything was taken to a landfill, like many miles away, where it becomes an absolute needle in the haystack. And it was months later before they actually searched that landfill, when it was almost laughable, where police are looking around like this is a big waste of our time. So there were a lot of things. The police were really, in their press conferences early on, were not releasing anything. They were releasing the number of tips that were coming in as if that was an achievement, but really being extremely careful in suggesting that the boys had some kind of role in this. They weren't identifying them. They were saying, some people may not have been fully forthcoming, but they were extremely careful, and there were a lot of pressure maybe on them that they were facing not to speak out about certain people who are, say, from wealthy families with high-powered lawyers in a school that doesn't want to be labeled as like harboring, kids who, may have been involved in some very serious partying activity and dangerous activity. So there's all that, and I could, that's the question is, what could have been done early on. There's a lot that could have been done early on. To jump a little further, a few months later, when the investigation went cold, the family of Lauren Spierer hired the private investigators, and they came to town, and you kind of saw the NYPD detectives, the retired kind of tough New Yorkers, come to town and clash with the local police department. You see, it's interesting to think what would have happened if you had, say, the hard-nosed, aggressive reporting that may happen, say, with NYPD involved versus, a small-town police force that has lots of competing concerns.
Yeah, that's going to be something that is so frustrating, because if true, the dumpster and all of that with the high-powered lawyers and the wealthy families, and I don't want to sound like crass about it, but they literally would have just thrown a body away and no one cared to look for it. And again, that has to be super frustrating. But do you think even after all this time, if one of the, hypothetically speaking, if they did this, if one breaks, do you think the rest of them will break? Or do you think after so long of getting away with it, they've pretty much maintained their stance the entire time and there's not a lot that's going to break them?
I think that that's a big question is can if indeed she did die in their presence, um, we're just purely speculating here. Those individuals were able to, close ranks and not share, keep certain things to themselves. Over time, if any one of them were to reveal something, it could, bring the weight of the world on all of them. So there's a reason why, they'd be reluctant to, say something now that they didn't say early on. However, one of my thinking anyway in the book was to push the case into the present, essentially, vet all the information, put it out there, get people talking about the case again. The idea is that this case is not going away. There are a lot of people who are very focused on it. Even the police put out a statement after my book came out saying, we're hoping this, brings new attention to the case. The family painfully opening up their veins essentially to, put word out also on the book. There's new pressure that could be brought to bear if indeed this theory is correct on them. But there's also people in their, circle of trust, whether it's a spouse or, a parent or even a lawyer who early on or over time that learned something. It only takes one of them to essentially crack and call authorities and say, hey, this is very interesting, and start going at one after the other. You could see how, that cone of silence could break. That's my hope. That's why I still have optimism that, this could break and that the attention matters.
Very cool. Well, congratulations on the book. It is an excellent read and a great audiobook listen as well. Where is the best place for listeners to pick up a copy?
Hopefully it's in your local bookstore, but Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, whatever your easiest way to get it is. But thank you. I appreciate you putting the word out on that. And I do believe that I get excited when people reach out to me, and I get it almost every day now. People who are reading this and emotionally impacted by it. And it's not. There are a ton of people in Indiana who've turned out when I came there and talked about the book, and a lot of people there who had participated in the search, say, or maybe loosely knew of, someone who knew Lauren. Over time, people have reached out to me, whether it's like a former boyfriend of Lauren Spierer or a family member of one of the people in the book. It's brought out a lot of passion, and I do feel again that the more attention that this gets, I'm excited that people are still, this wasn't just a book that came out and kind of faded after a week. It's, we're many months later now, and people are still have a vested interest. More people have a vested interest in reading it and, spreading the word.
Okay, we're back here for final thoughts after the conversation with Shawn Cohen. I thought it was a great conversation, great interview. He's really open, as much as he can be, I think, with his thoughts, without getting himself into any phone calls from lawyers and things like that. But yeah, he's thorough in tracking Lauren all the way as far as he could that night.
100%. And I'll say this one thing about him. As we spoke with him, I started to imagine a scenario where he would be coming to my door to ask me questions about something and how intimidating that would be, because he comes across very low key. and very calm about everything. And I could see that being used, and he kind of alluded to it in the conversation. He uses that to get into your head and get those answers that he wants, because there are certain ways, and this isn't a bad word, by the way, there are certain ways to manipulate somebody to get what you want from them, especially when you're in his position. And again, not a bad word. He needs to manipulate the situation. He needs to change the situation that he's in with a person that he needs answers from. And it's the only word I can think to use. So did you imagine that as well? Like a scenario where he's talking to you to get answers about something, and how he would use your own behavior to try to work his way into getting those answers?
Not exactly, but I do have to say I appreciate that Shawn and other journalists like Shawn exist and push for answers as hard as they do, because in this case of the disappearance of Lauren Spierer, the Bloomington police, they don't have answers. They have nothing. No one's asking questions from their side. So sometimes a journalist has to be aggressive to make some progress, and sometimes it really works, and I don't know if it's working in Lauren's case yet. I hope so. His book was released in May of 2024, and it's got a lot of reviews. I definitely have noticed a lot of people talking about it, so I do hope that the case is at least reinvigorated because of the book, which it seems like it has been. But as far as more people talking, I don't know if that's happened yet. Time will tell, I guess. Still, we're 13 years from Lauren's disappearance, but we see cases that are much older get solved still every week.
Yeah, and he's got his hooks in some people, and he's not going to release them until he gets what he wants. And you mentioned that you appreciate journalists who do that, and I have a great degree of admiration for that as well, because he understands that there will be some sort of collateral damage that comes with that, whether he's barking up the wrong tree, has a theory that it didn't pan out, and that ends up offending or alienating some people, but that's part of the job, I think. And I think he sees that, and it's probably what brings him to that calm level, where if he's going to let one thing like that bother him, it's going to take his entire profession, his entire practice down. You know what I mean? Like, he can't let all of that bother him. He has to just maintain the course.
Yeah, and it seems like he did have some tense moments with Lauren's parents back in 2011, but he had covered the story over the years, and as he said in the interview, he even would have breakfast with Lauren's folks occasionally and just kind of keep up with them and maybe write an anniversary article here and there. But he really felt, and I think Lauren's parents agreed with him, that if he were to dive back in and put all of his journalism into this case, into a book now, that it couldn't hurt the case, and I think some of the facts about Lauren's last night and days was something that the parents were maybe a little sheepish about or possibly embarrassed about in the early days. But I think they understand now why it was important for Shawn to put that out there. Stuff like, how intoxicated she was, and she left her phone and her shoes at the bar, and she hit her head on the I think it was on the pavement. So all these things really have to make you wonder how, what condition Lauren was in at like 4 a.m. on the day she went missing.
Totally. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was really happy that we didn't dwell on that during our conversation with Shawn, that we didn't keep asking questions and he didn't keep emphasizing how much alcohol she drank or how many drugs she took that night. She was very slight. You had mentioned at the top of the show that she was just under 5 feet, 95 pounds, and that's a lot of intoxication to be in such a small vessel of a body. And that isn't something to be stated and then turned around into, hey, young woman, attractive young woman who is drunk and has drugs in her system. What do you expect's going to happen? Like that, I'm glad we didn't dwell on it because we don't want that perception to be even considered, that we would say, come on, like, look at her. And because that's not the case at all. The responsibility is on the people that she was with and the people that she visited, and them to not have the wherewithal. And I know they're teenagers or, young adults, but you got to look at that situation and that human being and say, they can't take this anymore. This is not going to end well because it just physically can't. And I don't know what happened. No one knows what happened. Well, people do know what happened, but in this conversation, you and I don't know, but I do know that some people who were involved took advantage of that situation and weren't responsible.
Yeah, it seems like it. It seems like at least some of the young men around her that evening, not counting her boyfriend, it seems like some of them didn't have great intentions around her, and that is a very sad thing. And so she was in a townhouse, and that was basically the last time anyone is sure of where she was. And we don't know what happened inside that townhouse. In the book, what comes up is the idea of an accidental overdose. And then at least one of these young men scrambling to try to dispose of Lauren's body because they think, oh, this might ruin my life, my future, if the police are to find out what happened. Maybe she had stopped breathing or something. But this is like a sort of a thing that comes up in a lot of disappearance cases that we've covered over the years, Lance. Maura Murray's, Brianna Maitland's especially. And I just don't know how realistic that is. Like, I'm not going to put myself in that position because that doesn't do anyone any good. But it's hard to imagine anyone at that age, especially, just like snapping into it at 4 a.m. and being like, this is going to ruin the next 60 years of my life or whatever if I don't call the police right now. I just feel like panic, you call the police when you're panicked, if there's something bad happening. I don't know. It just, that whole idea of panicking, getting rid of somebody, and then being successful in disposing of a body when these young men weren't even, I don't believe any of them were from Indiana or, Bloomington area. They were there for college. So as another part of that, you have to find some spot that she wasn't discovered. And, it's in the book, and we spoke about it a little bit with Shawn, the dumpster right next to the townhouse apparently it could have been as easy as that. But again, like, that's a drastic thing to do, and to just think you're not going to get caught by putting a person into the dumpster right next to your apartment is kind of crazy to me.
Totally. I well said. I completely agree. And like you said, we've covered stories in the past where that has been one of the scenarios that is thrown out there. Not thrown out there. It's been one of the scenarios presented as an answer to what happened. An accidental overdose. People that they're with don't want that deceased person in their life for whatever reason, and then they snap into, well, here's what we have to do to get rid of a body so well there's no trace of it. Right? Like, that's incredible.
It's going through your head like, oh my God, I may get a wrongful death charge because I brought these drugs here and now someone overdosed on it and now I'm going to be culpable. And all that's going through your head, as the person falls to the ground. Like, I don't know. It seems like a lot to go through someone's head in a moment of panic like that.
Yeah, I agree. But what we don't know is like the time frame. Like, we don't know if she went to bed and everyone else went to bed and everyone woke up the next morning except her. And then more sober minds were able to concoct a plan. Right.
Yeah, no, it's true. We don't know the mechanics, and frankly, we don't know for sure that is what happened. I sometimes think that in those cases where it seems like there's no answers, I feel like the random stranger abduction is more likely. That has to go up the likely meter because there's nothing else to grasp on, you know?
Exactly. But I will say this, the nothing else to grasp on is also the trail of her activities throughout the evening and where it stopped. And where somebody says, I saw her over here, but there's no actual evidence of her being over there. So the trail of her stopped at some point. So I think that's where the, I guess, bullseye of the investigation has to be focused on, because I think what makes this so remarkable as far as the disappearance is how much evidence there was of her in certain areas, whether it was, you know, CCTV or like her trail was documented to a certain point. So where does it end? And backtrack from there. You know, it's like that's where we're at. Is that's where the trace ends. So how do you? It's tough. It's tough.
If there's any truth to her having left the apartment that night, and I know we have no evidence that she did leave that townhouse that evening, but if she did, you know, she was definitely a target for someone with bad intentions. If they're driving around or something like that, you know, like I don't know that she ever left, but if she did,
yes,
puts her in the danger zone.
Yeah. And not just her, like you and I at that time, if we were that intoxicated, we are also in some form of a danger zone to ourselves or the victim of somebody else. But truly tragic. I mean, I couldn't even imagine being a parent and one day your daughter is doing well in school and the next you don't even know where she is. And then it goes on for over a decade. I mean, it's really, really tough.
All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation. Definitely check out the book, College Girl Missing. I think it really is a great book. Very informative. Definitely gives you some more insight on what may have happened to Lauren, and you get to learn a little bit about Lauren and her family as well. And if you have any information, please call the Bloomington Police Department at 812-339-4477.
And we did mention at the top of the episode to go to findlauren.com. There's other numbers you can call if you have information, but I think the most important one is, other than the police department, is the anonymous tips. They take anonymous tips, and you can send those to a P.O. Box 1226 at Bloomington, Indiana 47402. It's a anonymous tip. No one's going to know, and it could lead to a lot of answers for this family.